So am I a King James onlyist? No, but some people have, due to the comments I've made in a recent video of mine, Universalism Didn't Die in 1961, I briefly talked about how I believe that an over-reliance upon Greek and Hebrew, overly focusing upon the original languages in Universalist apologetics has become somewhat of a crutch, and I think even actively hinders the spread of Universalism. And it's not that I'm against Universalists studying the original languages. I'm not against it by any means. I'm also a big supporter of alternative translations. That is, translations outside the mainstream that are more faithful to the original language. When I turned 16, I asked for a Young's Literal. That was one of my 16th birthday presents, and I also own a Hanson's New Covenant, which is John Wesley Hanson's translation of the New Testament / Bible commentary. And I'm hoping to acquire a copy of Hart's New Testament into my library in the near future. So I'm a big supporter of alternative translation, and I recommend every Universalist go and buy a Young's Literal or another alternative translation. Vote with your dollar, as they say. So I'm absolutely a supporter of alternative translation, and I'm a huge supporter of Universalist, Greek and Hebrew scholarship as well. I mean, I'm a huge fan of John Wesley Hanson, and he was a very influential figure in that field, and I'm a big supporter of all that. And I'm also a huge fan of the Total Victory of Christ, and if you've ever watched a Total Victory of Christ video, you know that most of his videos pretty much boil down to, a Greek study. I mean, most of his videos go down to a Greek study. And I have nothing against that. I think that's fine. But I have said my position is not that Greek or Hebrew is bad by any means. However, what I've come to believe is that the original languages, arguing from the original languages, are not a necessity in Universalist apologetics. And most Universalist apologists today believe it's a necessity. Like, there is no other way to explain passages like Matthew 25 without going into Greek and Hebrew. And that's where I disagree with my fellow Universalists, where most Universalists today, if you read most Universalist books today or watch most Universalist videos, they believe it is a necessity to explain passages like Matthew 25 and other, passages by going into the original language. And without it, Universalism would fall. And I've become increasingly captivated by a question, which is, could I still be a Universalist and just use a mainstream Bible translation like the King James? And when I was younger, I would have said no. But upon further study, I have come to the conclusion, yes, if the King James Bible was the perfect translation of the Bible, which I don't believe it is, I can confidently say I would still be a Christian Universalist, even if the King James was the true translation of the Bible, which I don't believe it is, but still. And there's a few reasons why I believe that teaching that it is not a necessity to go into Greek and Hebrew scholarship to prove universalism, that universalism could be true even if the King James Bible was the true Bible, is important. And I think it would be good for the spread of universalism if we start to embrace a mindset like that. So my argument is not that studying the original languages is bad, far from it, nor that supporting alternative Bible translations outside the mainstream is bad either, but rather simply that it is not a necessity, that a Universalist could just have a King James Bible and could still be a good, faithful Universalist and preach good, faithful Universalism from the King James. And there's a few reasons I believe this. For starters, I'll explain a few ways in which I use the King James to argue for universalism. Point one is that there are several instances inside the King James and other mainstream Bible translations that where forever, God's punishment is talked about as being forever, but couldn't literally be forever. It's mentioned being like eternal punishment, but it couldn't literally be eternal punishment. One example I think of quite a bit is in Isaiah 34, God's judgment on Edom. And this is used as an example of God's judgment on all the nations. And in Isaiah 34, verses 8 through 10, we read, "For it is the day of the Lord's vengeance, and the year of recompense for the controversy of Zion. And the streams thereof shall be turned into pitch, and the dust thereof into brimstone, and the land thereof shall become a burning pitch, and it shall not be quenched day nor night. The smoke thereof shall go up forever, From generation to generation it shall lie waste. None shall pass through it forever and ever. Now we see a description of Edom's judgment as being eternal. The smoke will eternally go up. No one will ever pass through the land again. But we know this couldn't literally be eternal. And this is, of course, important because John is referencing Isaiah in Revelation when he's drawing upon this very same imagery to describe the lake of fire and the judgment of the nations. There's another example. There's several examples. I'm not using all the examples here. I'm just using a few to make a point. One of these days I need to make a whole video about proving universalism from the King James Bible, because I think that would be an interesting video to do and would probably reach some fundamentalists. At least I pray it would. But in Jonah, let's see, Jonah, I've lost my place. There's Jonah. In Jonah 2:6, and this is Jonah in the belly of the whale, we read, I went down to the bottoms of the mountains. The earth with her bars around me was about me forever. Yet hast thou brought up my life from corruption, O Lord my God. So in Jonah 2:6, we read that the earth's bars were around about him forever. But Jonah was only in the belly of the whale for 3 days. In fact, inside the King James Bible, it's actually very interesting as well, because we have another thing that could be worked to support universalism, which is in Jonah 2:2. And I said, and said I, cried out by reason of my affliction unto the Lord, and he heard me. And out of the belly of hell I cried, and thou heardest my voice. So anyways, I was talking about Jonah 6, and I'll get back to 2. This is another example where it's talked about as being a forever punishment, but doesn't literally mean forever. And actually, in Jonah 2:2, it's very interesting because we see the language of Jonah in hell. And I know some people believe that Jonah actually died in the whale, but even if you just believe this is poetry, which I believe it is, this is more symbolic. I believe Jonah actually went into the belly of a whale. I don't believe the story of Jonah is metaphorical, but I believe the language about hell or Sheol is more metaphorical. Even if you take this as just poetry, it still implies that post-mortem salvation is possible. Even if you keep it as Sheol, as the modern translations do, it still implies the possibility of post-mortem salvation. So it's just very interesting to think about that. And then there's a few other examples I can go to. I actually recently, over a month ago now, I made a post. You can go look at my post about proving universalism from mainstream Bible translations. And I've mentioned more verses there, but I'll mention 2 more verses in the book of Jude. So in the book of Jude, in Jude 1:6, we read, and the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. Interestingly, the Young's Literal actually also translate this as everlasting chains. But these couldn't be everlasting chains, because then we mentioned that they will be ended. They'll be let out of these chains at the day of judgment. So this couldn't literally be everlasting. And then we also have in Jude 1:7, even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them, in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering a vengeance of eternal fire. So once again, we read Sodom and Gomorrah as an example of eternal fire, but Sodom and Gomorrah are annihilated. And of course, if you know what the Bible says in Ezekiel 16:53, we read that Sodom and Gomorrah will be restored. So this actually doesn't prove annihilationism like many say. It supports universalism because the punishment is temporary, but Sodom and Gomorrah will be restored in the end, as it says in the Bible. So those are just a few examples. There are several other examples I could go to. Once again, I need to make a whole video on this topic, but that's the first argument. We have multiple examples in the Bible of God's judgment being described as forever, God's punishment on the wicked being described as forever, but it couldn't literally be forever. We also see other instances in the Bible of where, for instance, the mountains are described as being eternal, or there's other examples in the Bible of things that are, like in Genesis 17, it reads that circumcision will be an everlasting covenant. But even if you view baptism as the successor of the circumcision, even then, that will eventually come to an end. So it's not an everlasting covenant. So we see multiple examples in the Bible where everlasting is both described the punishment and the other things that couldn't literally mean forever. Another example is that the Bible reads God's mercy endures forever. And one of the most famous examples of this is in Psalms 36, where we read 26 times in a row that God's mercy endures forever. And another popular passage is in Lamentations amongst a lot of universalists. So a lot of universalists like to read from Lamentations about this. And in Lamentations, there it is. In Lamentations 31 through 33, we read, "The Lord will not cast off forever, but through he hath caused grief, yet he will have compassion according to the multitude of his mercies. He does not afflict willingly, nor give grief to the children of man." So actually what I find interesting there is that if you go to a translation like the Young's Literal and other, more universalist translation, actually doesn't read "the Lord God won't cast off anyone forever." But yeah, I still hear a lot of mainstream universalist apologists, read it from that verse instead of the mainstream translation like the King James, which I find to be very interesting. But I actually don't take an issue with this being translated as "His mercy endures forever," or "the Lord won't cast off forever." So, I mean, that's just another thing that, people, it's just another example, because that's a Bible contradiction. How could God's wrath endure forever and his mercy endure forever? That's a Bible contradiction. And in light of course, what I've just mentioned, but also other facts about the Bible, we should take God's mercy enduring forever over God's wrath enduring forever, because that's more inconsistent with the God of love we read about in the Bible. And the third example is that, for instance, in Revelation, but also just in the passage I've just read to you from Isaiah, we read language of forever and forever. But I ask you this simple question: is there anything longer than forever? Of course not. By definition, forever is the longest anything could ever be. If something were bigger than forever, then by definition, that would be forever. So when the Bible says forever and ever, it's being hyperbolic. And in light of other things I've just mentioned, it shouldn't be taken literally. So just from the King James Bible alone, we have 3 pretty decent points. Examples in the Bible where God's wrath is described as being forever, but couldn't literally be forever. Examples, in the Bible where it mentions that God's mercy endures forever. And if we interpret these passages in light that God is a higher being than us, we should be siding with the passages that says God's mercy endures forever, and not the ones that say his wrath endures forever, especially when we see instances where it says God's wrath is forever, but isn't forever. And then finally, forever and ever is hyperbolic and shouldn't be taken literally. So just by using the King James Bible, those are 3 pretty decent points to explain those passages like Matthew 25. And the reason why I use this method, and if you watched my recent video about Trent Horn, you saw it firsthand, where I did mention, I do believe that, I did briefly mention that I believe that the passages that Trent Horn brought up were mistranslations. But then to prove my point, I went into some of the examples I've showed here today, opposed to going in the Greek and Hebrew. If you watch some of my older videos, I would have talked about the Greek and Hebrew. In fact, I used to do that in pretty much every single video at some point. I used to do that, and I eventually swapped over to the method I'm doing now. And one of the big reasons I've done this, there's several reasons. For starters, I just kind of realized that, I just became very interested by, there's really 2 reasons I've done this. First is just a practical reason from the channel's perspective, where I've kind of realized that, there are channels that do this, but better, there's like the Total Victory of Christ I mentioned, like he'll go into Greek and Hebrew and he does, what I would do, but just better than me. And not even just him, but multiple channels, they would do it, but better than me. So I kind of realized, well, if someone's actually seriously studying universalism, they'll stumble across these channels probably before mine. And even if they don't, if they're serious about studying universalism, they'll also go to these channels eventually and hear the arguments from Greek and Hebrew. And I kind of realized that since I'm not a master of the original languages by any stretch of the imagination, so I just kind of realized that if somebody's doing it better than me, I should just focus on what I can do best, and leave the Greek and the Hebrew up to the channels that do it better than me. That doesn't mean I don't want to study Greek and Hebrew. It just means that I kind of admitted that, like, some channels do it better than me. But also, there's the more practical side, because, this channel is called Missionary Universalist, and if you've watched this channel for any extended amount of time, you know that the message of the channel is that you can be a missionary anywhere I believe very strongly that if you believe in Christian universalism, that is a gift from God, and therefore you have a duty to spread Christian universalism, to evangelize. As Jesus says, you cannot keep your light underneath a bushel, and that's a fundamental teaching of this channel, that you can be a missionary anywhere. And what I kind of realized is that, if the primary purpose of this channel is, you can be a missionary anywhere, in a lot of instances, spending time in the Greek and the Hebrew actually hinders that mission and doesn't help it. There's a few different groups I can think of where actually going in the Greek and the Hebrew doesn't help universalism, but actually hinders universalism. One is your average layman. Take, for instance, Bob the Southern Baptist. Bob the Southern Baptist is just, a normal Southern Baptist. Every time his pastors ever mention Greek or Hebrew, it's in one ear and out the other, and all of a sudden, he stumbles across a universalist, and this universalist is going into some in-depth study into Greek or Hebrew when Bob the Southern Baptist doesn't know a lick of Greek, and he's confused, and he thinks it's kind of crazy. And then Bob the Southern Baptist is just going to be like, well, in Matthew 25, eternal life and eternal punishment is the same word, so it just must mean, you can't have eternal life without eternal punishment. And that's what Bob the Southern Baptist is going to say, and he's going to walk off. And I know that's the truth because I've seen it a million times. And if it's not the example from Matthew 25 I just mentioned, it's going to be, well, there are places in the Bible where Ionius is describing God, and, God's eternal. So then Ionius doesn't always mean eternal. And, that's going to be Bob the Southern Baptist reaction. And another is the church, the more institutional church, the educated, the laity, not the laity, but the more educated Christians, because a lot of very educated Christians, they think universalists are conspiracy theorists, or they're over-reliant upon this one point. They're making a mountain out of a molehill. And they even think universalists are conspiracy theorists for going against the mainstream consensus. And I know they're wrong about that, but we have to keep in mind, as universalists, that a lot of weird groups go out of their way to make their own translations of the Bible. For instance, Jehovah's Witnesses, they have their own special translation of the Bible, and they're not the only ones that have their own special translation. So, to mainstream Christians, universalists insisting that, I'm saying about this from a mainstream Christian perspective, this universalist comes along and is questioning everything you've ever, everything you've believed about hell, and fundamentally starting to question a lot of your beliefs about Christianity. And then on top of that, that universalist tells you the very Bible you're reading is wrong. How do you think they're going to react to that? And I mean, it's just, for a lot of people, that really turns them off the universalism. We have to remember that, it just is not going to, for a lot of people, telling them that the Bible they've been reading all their life is wrong is not going to be winning them over. It's going to be turning them away. The third group is the annihilationists. This is another point. Ion Ionius does not inherently prove universalism, because annihilationists will also argue from Ion Ionius to prove their points. And a lot of the argumentation I just made, examples where, eternal damnation couldn't literally mean eternal damnation, annihilationists use that all the time, and I've just seen the difference. Like, I've watched a bunch of mainstream Christian figures, I've listened to a bunch of mainstream Christian figures, and the difference is night and day, where I mention Ion Ionius, and they'll mention Matthew 25. If the same word for eternal life and eternal punishment are the same thing, and of course I'm aware there's an explanation to this. I've mentioned it in many of my videos in the past. There's actually several explanations, but, they'll be like, well, as simple as that. Or, of course, they'll mention examples where Ionius applies to God, and, they'll just, shut down the conversation there. But when the annihilationists will engage them on passages like Isaiah 34, verses 8 through 10, or, Jude 1:7, they'll have to admit to themselves, okay, eternal doesn't always inherently mean eternal. And I've seen them admit it. Like, okay, it doesn't always mean eternal. So if the annihilationists are being successful by doing that, and the universalists are not being successful by, doing what we're doing, then I say we should take the page from the annihilationists. Quite frankly, I think universalists should study annihilationism just so we can, quite frankly, I wouldn't say copy, because I think universalists have been doing some of the things the annihilationists are doing beforehand, because I read a bunch of 18th century universalist literature, and, these universalists were using a lot more Bible and a lot more scriptural quotation than a lot of universalists I've listened to today. And but a lot of annihilationists, annihilationists will pride themselves on being as like the plain biblical reading of the text, and I don't believe they are, because annihilationists are hypocrites. Because when it comes to like in John's gospel, this language of perishing, they'll be like, just take it literally, man. But then when you get the passages, talk about all people bowing the knee to Christ, or all people being saved, or Christ coming for all people, then the annihilationist is like, well, you can't take it literally. You got to take it more, it's not literal. And I think the annihilationists are hypocrites for that. And there's other reasons I think they're wrong. I'll talk more about that when I make a video on Genesis 3. I think is the best chapter to actually start a conversation on universalism about. And it's just, the annihilationists, I do think we should take a page from them. And one big advantage the annihilationists have over the universalists and a lot of apologetics is that the annihilationists can just use the King James Bible or use the NIV or use the ESV and just stick with that inside his debate. He doesn't have to start out, he doesn't have to tear apart the mainstream translations to make his point. And I think that gives a huge advantage to the annihilationists. Another group is the fundamentalists, where at least, I live in the South. I live in the rural South where there's a lot of Baptists. And if you know anything about a lot of Baptists, not all Baptists, but a lot of them, King James onlyism is a very predominant belief. And I know King James onlyists as friends and family. They believe the King James Bible is the best Bible. I haven't met many that believe the King James Bible is like divinely inspired. Most of them just believe the King James Bible is the best translation. And I'm like, if these people believe so strongly in the King James Bible, and it's my duty to evangelize to them, it's a waste of time to try to tear apart the King James Bible to make my point. Instead, I need to make the King James Bible my friend, not my enemy. So in my conversation with fundamentalists, I think I should, use the King James and stick with the King James instead of conversation with the fundamentalists. And even an evangelical more broadly, a lot of them, they have a favorite translation. And if you're starting to criticize, because a lot of people, they're very attached to their Bible translation, I've noticed. And it's like, some people, they really love their ESV. Some people, they really love their NIV. Of course, there's a whole lot of people that really love their King James. I'm one of those people. I really love my King James. A lot of people, they actually really grow attached to their translation. And I think if you start attacking the translation, something they consider to be a friend, something they spent years studying, they're going to turn their brain off to your universalist argumentation. And for those reasons, and for all those different people, all those different groups, I think universalists should start arguing from just mainstream translations. My argument is this: not that Greek and Hebrew study or arguing from Greek and Hebrew is bad, but rather that it's not essential. Because most universalist channels you go out there today, they're going to have multiple videos on Ion Ionius, and that's going to be a big part of the argumentation, or any comprehensive deep dive into universalism, defending it. That will be one of the points they raise. And for all the different groups I've just mentioned, that is a hindrance, not a help. So for those reasons, I've increasingly tried to kind of move away from that. Not to say I think it's bad, far from it. I think it's good, but rather, I just don't think it's essential. And that's the thing. I just don't think it's essential for argumentation. I don't believe it's unnecessary. I just believe it's essential. Not essential. That's rather kind of my point. It's not an essential for argumentation. And that's just kind of been my argument. Not that it's bad. So that's just kind of where I'm at. I don't believe the King James Bible is the perfect Bible or whatever. I don't condemn Universalist translation. I don't think Universalist, biblical scholarship is bad. I just don't think it's essential to argue from the Greek and from the Hebrew. And in many cases, I just think it's actually hindering us and not helping us. And there's just other things honestly, I just believe it's overstated. That's my final point. It's overstated. It's not the smoking gun some universalists portray it as. For instance, one thing I've heard amongst a lot of my universalists is they act like it's such a big, mind blower that the word translated as hell in the King James, or in other translations, most translations are actually doing a lot better about this. They act like it's this huge deal that like there's 4 different words we translate as hell. I've heard multiple universalists act like this is the greatest discovery since sliced bread, and I've never understood it. Part of it is I already knew there were multiple words that we translate as the English word hell before I was a universalist. They taught me that in Bible class when I was young, I remember our Bible teacher was talking about, and there's multiple words for hell. He taught us this back then. He said that, there are multiple different words for hell, and I've never thought this was this mind-blowing argument. It just really isn't. And besides, most translations, today are actually doing pretty good about that. They don't translate Sheol or Hades as hell anymore. They do translate Gehenna as hell, but they always, at least any decent Bible, is going to have a footnote that tells you that in the original language this is Gehenna. I'm not sure about Tartarus, because Tartarus is only mentioned one time in the Bible. I'm not sure what they translate Tartarus as right now. I haven't checked. But I just don't think this is that mind-blowing. And even Ion Ionius, this is going to be controversial. I think the best thing you can walk away is that it's ambiguous, because I do think there are instances in the Bible where Ionius could pretty easily be interpreted as being forever, or it would make the most sense. For instance, when describing God or God's mercy enduring forever, I think it makes more sense to translate Psalms 136, as God's mercy endures forever, opposed as God's mercy endures to the age. So that's my controversial take. I think there are instances inside the Bible where it makes more sense to translate it as forever opposed to age. And honestly, it's just not the smoking gun I think most people think it is, because once again, the annihilationists, they'll also argue from Ion and Ionius to prove their points. And also, I think the best thing you can walk away with is that, passages like Matthew 25 don't inherently preach eternal damnation. It's not 100% something. What it really means, if you translate properly, is, in the age to come. Which, to me, it's like, I think an in-depth study to Ion and Ionius rules out eternal damnation, but I don't think it inherently rules out annihilationism. And increasingly, that's the thing. When we're talking with infernalists, Ion and Ionius, I think, might be more impactful on debunking infernalism, like an in-depth deep dive. But when it comes to the debate of the future, which is the universalists versus the annihilationists, this is just not going to be the smoking gun a lot of people think it is. So yeah, I just don't think it's a smoking gun a lot of people think it is. I don't think it's as revolutionary like a lot of folks think it is. And I've just felt as a universalist apologist that I'm a better apologist, since I really tried to, deal with these texts instead of just explaining them with, in the Greek it's different. I actually tried to see, could I still be a universalist and just believe in the King James? And when I came with that conclusion, I felt like I'm a better apologist now, because when I was younger, I would have said, universalism wouldn't be true if the King James Bible was the correct translation. But now I would say, if the King James Bible is the correct translation, I would say, I could still be a universalist, as I've shown before. So that's all I've got to say. If you want to hear some of my other points about translation, I talked about them inside a post I made over a month ago. I think I've already talked about this in this video, but go check out my post. You can't miss this post, because it's a big picture of a cover of a King James Bible, like the inside of a King James, the cover page of King James Bible. You can just go look at that. I've made 5 points about translation. The other 2 about translation were that in modern Bibles, the translations are becoming more universalist as time goes on. So, for instance, if you go back to the 19th century and universalists were criticizing the King James, they would have said there are 3 words inside the King James that shouldn't be there. And those 3 words were damn, hell, and everlasting. And damn, as I mean damnation. And in modern Bibles today, damnation is out of the Bible. It's not in any modern Bible translation. And as I spoke about earlier, hell has been completely taken out of the Old Testament and is mostly gone out of the New. And the only word still there is everlasting. So if universalism is true and what we say about translations is true, then as time goes on, translations should become more universalistic, which they have. The other point is that all the passages that support universalism are the same in all translations, but the passages that don't support universalism are different. So, for instance, if I crack open my King James and my Young's Literal, my King James and my Young's Literal agree on Romans 5:18, or they agree on 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 21 through 22. They agree on those passages. But if I crack open my King James, my Young's Literal, and I start comparing Matthew 25, verse 46, or Revelation 14:11, they don't agree. So the passages that support universalism are the same in all the translations, but the passages that don't seem to work with universalism are different in all the translations. Those are the two other points I kind of make. So I just think that my argument is simply this: universalists don't always need to use Greek and Hebrew when we're talking to people about universalism. In fact, in some cases, I believe it's a hindrance. That really is my belief, and that's what I'm doing on the channel moving forward. I will occasionally mention Greek and Hebrew, but I will predominantly talk about the English Bible translations because I think that's just the most relevant to the work I'm doing. So thank y'all for watching. God bless. I understand if you disagree with me, that's fine. I'm not the Pope of Universalism, as I've said before. So if you have a different opinion than me, that's fine. But as I was saying, thank you for watching. God bless, and Christ will conquer.